So what is Svelte? Svelte is a modern JavaScript framework for building the user interfaces and web application. Unlike traditional frameworks like React.js or Vue.js, they do much of their work in the browser at runtime. Svelte shifts that work into a compile time. But still, why should anyone care about learning Svelte? When you write your Svelte component, a compiler converts them into a highly optimized vanilla JavaScript code before the app runs in the browser. So which simply means like no framework runtime bloat is shipped to the user. Unlike React.js or Vue.js, which uses something called the virtual DOM to manage the UI updates, Svelte automatically updates the DOM directly. This makes updates faster and less resource intensive. Svelte has a simple and clean syntax to define the reactive variables and state. It automatically tracks the dependencies and updates the UI when the state changes. Like other modern frameworks, your UI is built from a reusable component with their own markup, style, and logic, something which we are going to be covering in a lot of great detail. Smaller bundle and fast load time. Because Svelte compiles your code into minimal JavaScript, the resulting bundle tend to be smaller and faster. The syntax is straightforward and you can write less code compared to some other frameworks and libraries. All in all, Svelte is an amazing tool to work with. So now let's make a setup for our coding journey. So first of all, let me just open my terminal, and inside there we are going to be typing a few commands. So the first command will be npm create with at latest, which will allow us to create our project by using the with. Now it's going to ask us a series of questions like what will be the name of your project. In this case, I'm going to give it the name of like Svelte Learning, but you are more than welcome to give it any name which you prefer. Next up, it's going to ask us to select a framework. If you are using like React.js or vanilla JavaScript, you can totally choose there. But in this course, we are going to be covering the Svelte. So that's why I'm going to just choose the Svelte, and there we have it. Now we have to cd or change directory into that specific folder. And once we do, then we have to install all of the dependencies by which our Svelte.js depends on. So once that's done, then we have to open our project by using the code dot. So it's going to open there in our VS Code like this. So this is how our folder structure will look like. And now let me just expand this src folder. So inside there we have like a few more unnecessary folders and files like assets, lib, and so on and so forth. So now let me just select all of that unnecessary folder and also the files, and now let's just completely remove there. And once we remove them, this is how everything will look like. And now let's get into the components. So this is how we generally build our project. So we just create our index.html file where we put the markup of our project. Then we create our index.css file where we style our project. And finally, we just create our index.javascript file where we put the functionality of our project. Now this will work totally fine for a simple project, but whenever you want to work with a complex project, it will not work there. If you want to build like the next Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or something like that, it will not work. So if you want to work with those companies, your code will grow bigger and bigger. And this is not the efficient way to build your projects using that approach. So what is the solution? The solution is to use the components. So we are going to be splitting our UI into multiple components. So let's suppose if you want to build that same project using the components approach, so we are going to be still using HTML, still using the CSS, still using the JavaScript, but in one single file. Okay, so we are going to be defining a header component. So we are going to be defining our header.svelte component for our header. Now we are splitting our UI into multiple components. Then we are going to be creating our navigation component. After that, we are going to be defining our button component, and we can also define a component for both articles. We can create one component and we can reuse them again and again. And finally, let's just create the main component, and this is how we are going to be splitting our UI into multiple components. Still, we are going to be using HTML, still we are going to be using CSS and JavaScript, but now we are going to be defining multiple components for our project. So now let me just show you that in action. Back to my app.svelte component, and inside there, if you want to create our component, the first thing we have to do is that we have to write our script tag. And what is a script tag? A script tag is responsible for the JavaScript code where we are going to be putting our JavaScript code like the logics, function, loops, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be responsible for the JavaScript code. So that's why we are now providing our script tag. Next up, we have our style tag, and you already guessed it, inside there we are going to be writing our CSS code. If you don't want to provide they, you can totally ignore them and it will totally work just fine. And the rest of the file will be for the HTML, for our UI. So this is how our component will work. First of all, we would have our script tag where we are going to be writing our JavaScript code. Then we will have our style tag in which we are going to be writing our CSS code. And finally, we are going to be writing our UI inside this entire file. So now let me just build a simple hello world component so that you can see it a bit better. So I'm gonna just remove all of the code from here, and now inside there we just have to write our h1 without writing our JavaScript code, without writing our CSS code, and so on and so forth. So I'll just write like h1, and inside there I'll just specify the hello world. And if we preview this, it's gonna give us that hello world on our UI. So this is how we are going to be building a simple component in Svelte. So there was just a single component. Now let's create a multiple component for our project. And to do that, we can totally define all of that components inside the src folder. But in this case, I'm going to just create a new folder with the name of components, and inside there we're going to be defining all of that components. So now let me just break this down one by one. So first of all, we have our footer.svelte component. Inside there we're going to be just writing like a footer tag, and it's going to say like this content is coming from the footer component. Now let me go to the header component, and inside there we're going to be defining our header, which will say like this content is coming from the header component. Now let me go to the navigation, and inside there we are going to be defining our nav, and it's gonna say like this content is coming from the navigation component. And finally, let me just go to the sidebar component, and inside there let's just define our aside, and it's gonna say like this content is coming from the sidebar component. Now that we successfully created our component, the next thing that we have to do is that we have to go to the app, and inside there we have to register our components. So let's just first of all import all of that component inside this file so that we can use there. And once we successfully import all of that files, the next thing that we have to do is that we have to call or execute our components. And once we do that, let's just check out the result of there. So it's going to give us all of the result from all of that component right here. Like this content is coming from the navigation, sidebar, header, and footer components. So this is how we are going to be defining multiple components in our Svelte project. So now let's talk about something called the text interpolation. So text interpolation refers to the process of dynamically binding data to the content of HTML element in a template. It allows you to display the value of JavaScript expression or variable within a markup. Now what do I mean by all of this gibberish? Now let me just break this down one by one. So I have a simple JavaScript code. So I'll just declare a variable with the name of name, and it's going to hold the value of Jordan. I'm gonna also write a bit of HTML code which will just say like my name is and nothing else than there. Now I want to connect this JavaScript code with my HTML code. This process is called the text interpolation. So basically we are going to be taking the value of this name variable, and then we are going to be rendering there to our UI, like basically rendering there in our HTML. This process is called the text interpolation in Svelte. Now let me just show you there in action. Back to my app component, inside there I only have a script tag. Inside the script tag we have to declare a variable with the name of name, and it's gonna hold the value of Hussein. Now we want to render that value to the UI, so for that we are going to be writing our h1, which will just say like the label will be my name is, and then we are going to be rendering that value from this name variable by using this curly braces. And once we do that, let's just preview this. So it's going to give us like my name is and then the variable name, which is Hussein. Okay, so this is how we are going to be interpolating our content from our JavaScript to our HTML. So now let me just give you a few more examples. So now we have another variable with the name of age, and now inside there we are storing the value of number, which is 23. And now let's just render that to our UI by using our h2, which will say like my age is and then the age by using these curly braces. And once we preview there, so it's going to give us like my age is 23. And let me just give you one more example. So the location will be set to China, and let's just render there to our UI, which will say like my location is and then China. Now we are going to be defining yet another variable with the name of hobby, which will be set to coding. And now we have to render that to our UI by using our h4. Basically you can use like any HTML element which you prefer, but in my case I'm just using like these heading tag just for the beauty of it. So now let's just preview there. So it's gonna give us like my hobby is coding and my location is China. Let me just show you something special. In some situation we would want to render like HTML content. So in this case you can see like let's simple HTML, and inside there we are just basically writing the HTML code. So we have a paragraph which will say like this is a simple, and then we have our B tag which will bold our text. So inside there we have our HTML paragraph. So whenever you want to render the content of that HTML, so for that, first of all, you are going to be using this add HTML and then the variable name. You have to keep this in mind. Like whenever you want to render the content of HTML using the string, so for that you have to specify this add HTML and then your variable name, and then it's gonna give you like this is a simple an HTML paragraph. Okay, so this is what we call the text interpolation in Svelte. Now let's talk about one of my favorite topic in this course, which is called the props. So props, also known as properties, are a way to pass data from a parent component to a child component. Props allow you to communicate between components by allowing the parent component to pass data down to its child component. This is useful for creating a reusable and modular components. So now let me explain that even more. So here you can see we have two components. So we have a component A and component B. Now we are going to be taking that component B and we are going to be calling the inside the component A. So the component A will become the parent component and the component B will become the child component. Now let's suppose inside the component A we have some sort of a data, and we want to paste that data from the parent component down to the child component. So we are going to be doing that by using something called the props or properties in Svelte. So now let me show you that in action. So I have a app.svelte component and child.svelte component. Now let me go ahead and go inside the app component, and first of all we have to import our child component and then we have to call this component right here. Now we are going to be passing our prop or our value. So in this case I'm now providing like name is equal to and then the string value, but you are more than welcome to provide any name for your props. So you can specify like orange, banana, Hussein, Jordan, or your name or anything which you prefer, but in my case I'm only calling my name as a name. And then for the value I'm now providing a string value, but you can provide like number, booleans, or anything which you prefer. Now let me just pass another prop which will be for the edge. As you can see I'm now giving it another name which is the edge, and I'm also passing a different kind of value and different data type of value. Now in this case this is a number data type, so I'm gonna have to wrap that inside the curly braces. And now let me just pass my location and also the hobby. So this is how we are going to be passing our data from the parent component. The app is the parent component, and now this child which we are now calling inside the app component is a children component. So this is how we are going to be passing our data from the parent component to the child component. But now the question is, how in the world we are going to be even capturing or rendering that inside our child component? And to do that we are going to be using something called the props rune. So it's gonna allows us to capture all of their props which it is now taking from the parent component. So now let me just store that inside the all props variable, but you can give your variable any name which you prefer. So now let me just render there to the UI. So I have a div, and inside this div I have a paragraph which will just provide the label of name, and then outside from this label we are now providing like all props, and from all of their props we are only interested in the name prop. So now if you preview there, it's gonna give us like name, and the name will be set to Hussein. And why is that? That's because we are now providing this value from our prop, from our parent component down to the child component. We can provide like age, and age will be set to all props.age, and it's gonna work totally fine. We can also specify our location like all props.location, and finally we can also specify all props.hobby. If we preview this, so it's gonna give us like name will be set to Hussein, age 23, location China, and hobby will be set to coding. Now this will work totally fine. This is amazing and everything, but we can totally improve our code a bit more. First of all we have to delete that all props, and we have to just destructure all of their values like name, age, location, and hobby. And also we can totally remove all of their props like all props dot, all props dot, all props dot, and so on and so forth. We can totally delete them, and now it will totally work. First of all we are now just destructuring all of the props, and then we are rendering that to the UI, and it will work exactly the same like name, age, location, and hobby. Everything will be exactly the same. We can also do a bit of more improvement. Now let me just show you there once again. So basically I have an app and also the child component once again, and we are going to be importing our child component. Let's just call there, and instead of providing some sort of a name for our prop, we can directly pass our data inside there like name, age, location, hobby, and we can totally destructure there and render there to the UI, and it will work just fine like name, age, location, and hobby. So this is how we are going to be passing our data from the parent component down to the child component using props. So now let's talk about the state. So state is like a container that holds our data, and this data is displayed on our UI. Whenever we modify the data inside the container, the UI updates accordingly. So what does all of this gibberish even mean? So basically we have a simple container, and inside this container we are going to be storing different data, and whatever we store inside this container will show exactly on our UI. And also whenever something changes inside that container, it will change our UI according to that specific data. Like it doesn't matter if something big or small happen inside our container, it will update our UI. So now let me just show you that in action. Back to our app component, inside there we are going to be using our state rune from the Svelte. Basically, we are now creating our container in which we are going to be storing our data, and whenever that data changes, it will update our UI accordingly. Now let me just store that inside the count variable, and you can also see we are now passing the value of 0 inside our state. So this is how we are going to be defining our state. Now let me just render that to our UI. So basically we are now taking the value of that state which is 0, and we are now rendering that to our UI. So now we are going to be defining two buttons. The first one will allows us to increment our counter, and the second one will allows us to decrement our counter. But currently they don't do anything because we did not attach any event listeners to there. So if you want to attach the event listeners in Svelte, so for that we are going to be using in lowercase the on click event handlers. These are the event listeners. So we also have like the on mouse move, on mouse remove, on keyboard type, and there are a lot of them, but in this case I'm now only passing the on click event handler right here. So then we are also passing the increment and decrement functions. So now let's just also create those functions. So basically it's gonna allows us to increment our counter by 1, and the second one allows us to decrement our counter by 1. So now our component is totally ready, but now we have to preview them inside our browser. So let's just go to our browser. So we have our count which will be initially set to 0. We have an increment button, and we also have a decrement button right here. So if I click on the increment button, so anytime I click on there, it's gonna increment my counter. So now if I click on the decrement button, so anytime I click on there, it's gonna decrement my counter by 1. So this is how we are going to be working with the state, and this is how we are going to be also attaching the event listener to our component. And that was the example number 1. Now let me give you one more example. So here you can see we are going to be defining our state, and inside there we are now passing the value of string which is now set to Hussein. The next thing that we have to do is that we have to render that to our UI, and also we are going to be providing our input field, and currently we are not doing anything with this input field. Now we are going to be binding the value of that state variable. So to do that we are going to be using this method right here, or this syntax to be precise. We are going to be using the bind, and then we are going to be providing a value, and then we have to specify that value which we want to attach for our input field right here. So in this case I want to attach the value of name which is now set to the state of Hussein. So if we preview there, it's gonna gives us the value of Hussein right here. But now let me just remove there, and once we remove there, now we can type our own values right here. So if I just type like ALEX, so it's gonna also render there to a UI, and whenever we type this, so it's gonna also render there to the UI. So that was the example number 2 of the state. So which simply means like we are not limited to store the numbers values. We can also store like the string values, the objects, the arrays, or anything which we prefer. We can totally use them for our state. Now let me show you how we are going to be deriving the value from our state. First of all, we have to define our state. So we have a first name and last name, and now we are going to be using something called the derive rune. Basically, it's gonna allows us to combine more than one state. So whenever something changes on the one state, it will automatically reflect that on our UI. So now let me just paste my first name and also my last name. We can totally use this syntax, or we can just use a string concatenation. Both of them will totally work. Now let me just store that inside the full name variable, and that's totally done. Let me just render that to our UI. Also, we are going to be using our input field, and now we are going to be binding the value of the first name. And for the placeholder, we are going to be passing like enter your first name, or just a first name would be fine. We can also create another input field, and we are going to be binding the value of last name, and it's gonna say like last name. So if we preview then, it's gonna give us like Alex and then Mercer. So if we just remove them, we can now type our own values. So I'm gonna just write like HUXN, and it's gonna also show them on our UI. Now let me just go to the second input field, and I'm gonna just write like WEBDEV, and now it's gonna give us the Hussein web dev right here. So this is how we are going to be deriving the value from our state using the derive rune in Svelte. So now let me just give you one more example of the derive. So first of all, we have to define our state. So the first one will be for the price and the second one will be for the quantity. And now we are going to be using the derive function, or rune to be precise. And inside there we can just specify like price time the quantity, and then we are storing the inside the total. Okay, so now let me just render that to our UI. So we are going to be basically interpolating all of that values from our states, and we are going to be showing them inside our UI. Now we are going to be attaching our input field, and the type will be set to number, and we are going to be also binding the value of price, which will be set to the placeholder of price, and we are going to be also binding the value of quantity, which will just say the quantity. So if you preview there, so it's going to give us like price will be set to 100, quantity 2, and the total will give us 200 right here. First of all, let me just change the quantity to 3. So it's going to give us the total of 300 right here. If we change the actual price from like 100 to 300, it's going to also update the inside the total. So now the total is set to 900 right here. We can also change like the quantity to 500 and also the price to 500. So now it's going to give us like $25 right here. So this is how we can play around with the state and also derive rune in Svelte. Let's talk about the children props. So we use the children props whenever we want to paste the HTML content directly to our components. So let me just show you there. So here you can see we have two components, like the component A and the component B, and whenever we call that component B inside the component A, so it will become the child component and the component A will become the parent component. You guys already know all of that stuff. So now we have some sort of a HTML content inside the parent component, and we want to paste that directly to the child component. So we are going to be using a child or children for that. So now let me just show you that in action. So once again, I have an app component and I also have a child component. Inside the app component, we have to import our child component. We have to call there, but we are not going to be just calling there as a self-closing tag. In this case, we are now pasting a children or HTML content. So we have to close there like this, like the opening tag and the closing tag. Now inside there we can specify our HTML content like the h1, which will be set to hello world. We can specify the ULLIs. You can specify like basically any HTML content which you want to paste from your parent component down to the child component. Then we have to go inside the child component and we have to destructure the children's from the prop. Not a specific thing like the h1 or the ul or li. We have to destructure the children, and now we can render those children's by using this add render method, and then we also have to call this children right here inside there. And once we check this out, so it's going to give us like hello world, and it's going to also give us like home, about, and contact, which will work totally fine. So this is how we are going to be pasting the HTML content from the parent component down to the child component using the children's. Let's talk about how we are going to be iterating over through a collection of data using the each. So each is a special block that help us loop through a list or a collection. For example, like the array, object, etc., and display the item in that specific list. So now let me just show you that in action. So here you can see back to my app component. Inside there we have a simple list like the friends. We have like Alex, Bob, Charlie, Dave, and Eve. So now you want to iterate over through all of this list, and we want to render each person to the UI using the li or ul or something like that. So to do that, we are going to be using a bit of weird syntax which looks something like this. So we have to first of all open and close our curly braces, and for the first portion we have to specify the hash symbol and then each, and then for the second portion we have to specify the backslash and then each. So this is how we are going to be opening and closing our each loop inside the Svelte. Now that's the first thing that you have to keep in mind. The next thing that we have to do is that we have to specify like for which data we want to iterate over through and where we want to store that data. So for that we are going to be just specifying like the friends. So now this friends is this entire collection like the Alex, Bob, Charlie, and so on and so forth. And we want to iterate over through all of this list, and we want to store the value of each of them inside the friend. Okay, so like inside the friend variable. So now you want to render that to our UI. So I'm going to just write like li, and I only want to render the friend, not the friends, not the plural one, but just a singular one. So once we preview that inside our browser, so it's going to give us like Alex, Bob, Charlie, Dave, Eve, and so on and so forth. And now let me just give you one more example. So back to my app component, I'm going to specify like movies, which is now array of objects. So inside there we have the title and year and so on and so forth. Now we want to iterate over through this list, and we want to do something with that. Like for instance, if you want to render the title and the year of the movie, so to do that we are going to be once again using that weird syntax, and then inside there we are going to be specifying like movies as movie. Okay, and now inside there we have to just specify like the li, and we can render the movie dot title, and also we can render the movie dot year. So it's going to give us the movie title and also the movie year. So if we preview this, so it's going to give us like Inception 2010, The Matrix 1999, and so on and so forth. So this is how we are going to be trading over through a collection of data, and this is how we are going to be rendering that to our UI. Let's talk about the conditional rendering. So conditional rendering refer to the ability to conditionally display or hide elements in the UI based on a certain condition or expression. So what do I mean by all of this gibberish? So now let me just explain that as simple as possible. So here you can see we have our basic sign up page right here, and now on this sign up page we can define different conditions. So the first condition will be if the user did not specify their credentials and they try to sign up, we are going to be throwing an error. We will say like please provide your email and please provide your password. And what if they specify their email and password? Now we can define yet another condition. What if they are not registered in our app? So if they are not registered, we are going to be throwing another error. We will say like user not found. They have to register first. So if the user click on this register button, we are going to be redirecting them to the register page. And now here we can specify even more condition. If the user did not specify anything inside this input field and they click on the register button, we are going to be throwing an error like please enter your name, email, and password. That's the first thing that we have to do. And what if they specify their name, their email, and also their password? Now we can define yet another condition. Their name is totally fine, but their email is short and also their password is short. So if they try to register, we are going to be throwing an error like please enter your valid email and password should be at least 8 characters. That's totally done. Just like that, we are going to be providing a lot of conditions based on our UI. That was just a simple example, and now let me just show you that in action. Back to our app component, and inside there we have to define our variable with the name of isVisible, and it's going to be holding the value of true. Now we are going to be working with the if statement, not the elif statement, not the else statement, but only with the if statement. So to work with them, we are going to be using that weird syntax once again, but instead of providing the each, we are going to be providing the if statement right here. Okay, so we have to provide first of all the opening and closing curly brace, and inside there we have to use the pound symbol and then if. Then we have to use the opening and closing curly braces, we have to use the slash and provide our if statement right here. So this is how we are going to be defining our if statement, and now we have to specify our condition. So for the condition, we are going to be using that variable which is now set to the isVisible variable right here. And now inside there we are going to be specifying our UI, and based on that condition this UI will either show or hide. So we are now creating a paragraph which will say like this message is visible. So once we see there, it's gonna give us like, yeah, this message is visible because the isVisible variable is set to true. So that's why we can see the content of that paragraph. Now let's just provide a button which will allow us to toggle the visibility of that paragraph. So whenever somebody clicks on this button, so it's gonna just basically show or hide the visibility of this paragraph. So now let me just show you there. So here you can see we have our paragraph and also our button component. So if we click on this button, so it's gonna hide there. If we click on there once again, so it's gonna unhide there. If I click on there once again, so it's gonna hide there. If I click on there once again, so it's gonna unhide there. So yeah, this is how we are going to be toggling the functionality of our paragraph using this button right here. So that was the example number 1 of the if statement. Now let's talk about the elif statement. So once again, we have to just create our variable with the name of score which will be set to 80. And now we are going to be using the if statement to provide our condition, and the condition will be set to score. If score is greater than or equal to 90, in this situation we are going to be providing a paragraph which will just say excellent. But if that's not the case, now this is how we are going to be specifying our LF block. If that's not the case, we are going to be using the opening and closing curly braces. Then we have to provide the colon and then specify the else and then F right here. So now if that's not the case, like if the score is not greater than or equal to 90, then we are going to be providing another condition. Like if the score is greater than or equal to 75, in this situation, we are going to be providing a paragraph and which will just say like good. And now we have to render that to our UI. So the score is now initially set to the score, which will be set to 80. Now we are going to be attaching two buttons. So the first button will just increase the score by 5 and the second one will just decrease the score by 5. So if you preview there, so it's going to give us like the score is set to 80. That's why we are now getting good. If I click on the increase score, so the score is now increased to 85, still good. If I click on there once again, and now the score is set to 90, and now it's going to change there to the excellent. Instead of a good, now it's going to give us excellent. But if I click on the decrease score, once I click on there, it's going to just change that to 85, still good. 80, still good. So this is how we are going to be working with the if and also the else if. And now let's talk about the final one, which is the else block. So first of all, we have to define a variable with the name of hour, which will be set to the state of 20. Now we are going to be defining our conditional blocks right here. So first of all, if hour is less than 12, so we are going to be showing like good morning. If hour is less than 18, we are going to be showing like good afternoon. Otherwise, we are going to be just showing good evening. Just like a simple conditional statement in JavaScript, this is how we are going to be using the in Svelte. And now if you preview this, so now it's going to give us the good evening because the hour is set to 20. That's why we are now getting this good evening right here. And that was it about the conditional rendering in Svelte. Let's talk about the snippets. So snippets are a way to create a reusable chunks of markup inside our components. So snippet allows us to reuse content within our component without extracting it into a separate component file. So what do I mean by all of this gibberish? So now let me just explain that as simple as possible. So you can imagine like I built this entire UI by using a single component. This entire UI is not built with multiple components. It is only built with a simple component, which is an app component. Now inside this component, we have this search bar which we want to use down right here at the bottom. Now I know a lot of you will think like, Hussein, just define another component and put the logic of that search bar, then you can use that at the top and you can also use that at the bottom. Yeah, you totally can do that, and this is what you will do. But now in this case, I just don't want to do that. Why is that? I'm gonna tell you why is that, but just bear with me for a few seconds. So I just don't want to use a search component. Instead, I'm gonna just use a snippet. I'm gonna define a snippet once. I can use that anywhere inside our component. So now I know a lot of you will think like, Hussein, why did I just choose this approach? Well, I choose this approach because snippets are not used for a simple things, for a simple component. If you want to use a snippet, you're going to be using it in a component where there is a lot of stuff. Like you're going to be using a snippet for a huge amount of code, not just for a dummy component like a button component or a card component or something like that. You're going to be using a snippet which is just a reusable code which you will use inside a huge component. That's why I choose this approach. So now let me just show you that in action. Back to my app component, and inside there we are going to be working with this user's data, and each user will have the ID, name, age and location. Now we are going to be defining a simple snippet for that, and to do that, this is how the syntax will look like. First of all, we have to just write like the opening and closing curly brace, and inside there we have to use the pound symbol and then snippet. This is how we are going to be defining our snippet, but for each file we can have like more than one snippet, so we have to specify some sort of a name for our snippet. In my case, I'm gonna just call mine as a user card, but in your case you can call it whatever you prefer. It's gonna also take an optional parameter. If you want to specify there, you totally can. If you don't want to provide there, you don't have to, but in my case I am going to provide this user right here as a parameter. Now inside there we are going to be just creating a simple card which will allows us to render our users. So we are going to be providing like the name, age and location which will be coming from this user. Now that we successfully created our snippet, the next thing that we have to do is that we have to render that to the DOM. So if you want to render there, so for that we are going to be using this render function, and then we have to specify the snippet name Then for the parameter, we have to specify some sort of a data. Now that we are iterating over through all of that list, and we are just putting each of the user inside this user object, and then we have to specify the inside the user card, and it will now render there to the DOM like this. So now it's gonna give us like name of Alice, age of 28, location New York City. So yeah, this is how we are going to be creating our simple snippet. That was the example number 1. Now let me just give you one more example. Now we are going to be working with this products array, and inside there we can have like a lot of products, but in this case I only specify like one, which will have the ID of 1, name of product 1, price will be something like 19, and also the image URL. That's totally done. The next thing that we have to do is that we have to create a snippet for that. Now that we successfully define our snippet, it is also taking this product, and from that product we are now rendering the URL, name, and also the price. Now finally we have to just render there by using this render method, and if you just preview then, so it's going to give us like the product image, product name, and also the product price right here. So this is how we are going to be working with the snippets in Svelte. Let's talk about the side effect or the effect. So effects are a function that runs when the state updates and can be used for things like calling a third-party libraries, drawing on a canvas element, or making a network request. So what do I mean by all of this gibberish? So now let me just explain them one by one. Back to my app component, and inside there we have to define our count. Then we have to log that count to the console. After that we have to render that to the DOM, and finally we are going to be creating a button, and whenever we click on this button it will increment our counter. Let's preview that. On the one side we have our UI, on the other side we have our console. So whenever I click on this plus button it will increment our counter, but as you can see inside the console it will not update that there. Why is that? That's because we are not using the side effect, which is the effect which we are going to be using in a few seconds. Let me just click on there once again. Still it is updating the UI, but it is not showing there inside our console. Let me just click on there once again. Nothing is happening. Now we have to introduce our effect, which is a rune in Svelte, which will allows us to work with the side effect. So basically this is just a rune, and inside there we are going to be passing a callback function, and now we are going to be taking that console log and we have to put there inside this callback function right here. And now if we preview there, and if I click on this plus button right here, it will update there on the both side. It will update the UI, it will also update the console right here. If I click on there once again, still everything is now updating right here, as you can see. So that was the example number 1. Now let me just give you one more example. Once again back to my app component, and inside there now we are going to be defining our username, and now we have to create a simple input field, and we are going to be binding that username as a value to this input field. And now we are going to be using the effect rune, and in this case we are going to be performing the side effect. And what is a side effect? Now we are accessing the document.title. We are going to be accessing there, and first of all we are going to be providing the welcome and then the value from our state. So now we are performing a side effect. That's why we are now putting there inside our effect right here. So now let's just preview there. It's gonna give us that guest, and now inside the title it's gonna first of all gives us the logo of our Svelte, then it's gonna give us the welcome and then guest. Now let me just remove this guest from this input field, and I'm gonna type something else, like let's suppose if I type H U X N, so here you can see it's gonna show there inside our UI. So now let me give you one more example. So inside there we are going to be defining our score state, and the initial value will be set to 0. And now we have to just render that to our UI by using the text interpolation. And now we are going to be performing a side effect, which means like we are going to be interacting with our DOM APIs. So now we are using like set interval function. Now inside there we are just adding 1 to there on each second. So like whenever each second passes, we are going to be adding 1 to our second stat. And after that we are just cleaning up our state by using the clear interval, and we are now passing our timer inside there. So these are basically the DOM APIs, which I hope you guys already know. So now if you just preview there, so for every second it will just increment our seconds right here.